היי, שלום לכולם. כולם שומעים? Okay. So the role of מעשיות in the teaching philosophy of Yosef Misas. Rabbi Yosef Misas was a prolific writer whose writing spans the breadth of the rabbinic tradition and is often exemplary of North African rabbinic writers, their values, moral orientations, and worldview. Certainly, Misas's legal writings bear some moral, educational, and philosophical value, but his non-legalistic writings extend into morally complex spheres in ways that are not limited by legal discussion. These non-legalistic texts often do contain direct halakhic instruction or provide analyses of halakhic concepts. However, they also extend beyond the concrete rules of Jewish law. Of the non-legalistic texts which Misas produced, today I'll be focusing on Nhletabot, Misas's commentary on Pirkei Avot, as a crucial piece of understanding Misas's teaching philosophy. There are obvious connections between Pirkei Avot, a text which heavily centers on moralistic statements, and classic rabbinic wisdom in understanding Misas's teaching philosophy. However, Nhletabot extends beyond this surface level connection, as the text is not merely commentary. Rather, Misas's Nhletabot is constructed of a collection of Derushim, sermons, which are based on actual sermons which Misas gave during the 1940s and 50s. Misas's introduction to Nhletabot. From the opening of his introduction, Misas argues that his role as a congregational rabbi, Masiyot, serve as a certain kind of rabbinic stories, and they are one of the most effective tools for connecting with his audience. Further, he establishes several reasons for why Ma'asiyot are not merely an educational tool, rather among the best educational tools. Ma'asiyot, Misas argues, are appropriate to explore most topics in Judaism, are more effective than other kinds of rabbinic literature at making a direct impact to the listener or reader, and spread effectively from his audience to their friends, family, and neighbors. Misas believes so strongly in Ma'asiyot that in his argument for the strength of these texts, he uses a Ma'asiyah to demonstrate this point. The first Ma'asiyah is the story of a secular man, Adam Hoshi B'deotav, who is compelled after hearing Ma'asiyot by a storyteller hired during his son's infancy to return to religious observance. Through this example, not only is the introduction of Nhletabot an introduction to the text itself, but it is also a way for Misas to introduce the genre of Ma'asiyot and the style and content which he includes as well. Beyond the various reasons which Misas provides for the superiority of Ma'asiyot, his own personal experience with them likely serves as a stronger proof of concept for their role in his teaching. Misas began Nhletabot as a community teaching project in Meknes in the year of 1943, and this teaching endeavor continued for roughly 10 years, based on the 521 Derushim. This decade-long project is both proof and reinforcement for Misas's belief in the efficacy of Ma'asiyot as an educational tool, and explains why he not only wants to emphasize the importance of Ma'asiyot, but why they play a substantial role in his overall rabbinic career. So what do we know about Sifrei Ma'asiyot and what are Ma'asiyot? So the genre of Ma'asiyot in the form of a Sefer Ma'asiyot, among which Nhletabot can be counted. This genre of Ma'asiyot is complex and multifaceted, with many analogs within and beyond the Jewish tradition. From within the rabbinic tradition, some of the earliest precursors to Ma'asiyot are the Midrashim and Agadah of the Tanaitic and Amaritic rabbinic periods, and possible parallels can even be drawn with the biblical text itself. However, as the body of rabbinic literature is continually expanding, the genre of Sifrei Ma'asiyot finds its first concrete and total conceptual and self-aware emergence in the 11th century work of the Gaon Nisim ben Yaakov of Kairouan. He produced a book known in Hebrew as Sefer Ma'asiyot HaChamim V'hu Chibur Yafeh Me'Yeshua, a dedicated collection of Ma'asiyot. Nisim ben Yaakov establishes the place of a dedicated book of Ma'asiyot within the Jewish tradition, but it is apparent both through explicit admission by Nisim and through academic analysis that this genre is at least partially borrowed from the Islamic tradition. This becomes clear when turning to the title of the text in the original Arabic, as well as some of the stories contained within the text. First, the title. Kitab Faraj Ba'da Shidda, the Book of Comfort After Adversity, shares a title with several parallel Islamic texts of the 11th century. This extra-rabbinic influence also appears in the body of the text itself, with the presence of some Ma'asiyot in Nisim ben Yaakov's text with seeming Islamic origins. For example, one of the first Ma'asiyot in Kitab al-Firaj is a story of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi traveling with Eliyahu, performing his divine duties in the world which perplex Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Eliyahu eventually explains his actions, which seem to be unjust, but in fact are an enactment of not only justice, but God's will. This text shows a striking parallel to the story in Surat al-Kahf, ayat 66-82 from the Quran. In the Quranic version, the perplexing actor is a servant of God, later identified as a Khadir in the Islamic tradition, a mystic who holds special knowledge, also known as a green one. And the confused travel companion is none other than Musa, Moshe, the prophet of the Jews. This Ma'asiyah presented by Nissim ben Yaakov may not necessarily be based on the Quranic narrative, and they may share a pre-Islamic folk origin, but certainly has some Jewish connections. Yeah, for example, both stories featuring Jewish characters. Notably, this Ma'asiyah also appears in Nhletabot, so the connection between this body of Sifrei Ma'asiyot literature and Mesas's own writing find footing through the reproduction and citation of such texts. Obviously, the kinds of Ma'asiyot which appear in Nhletabot are not limited to stories from Nissim ben Yaakov's Kitab al-Firash. Rather, they are from a variety of sources, including but not limited to Midrash, Talmudic stories, and some even being seemingly historical accounts. Due to the limitations of my research, I have not analyzed all of the Ma'asiyot across Nhletabot and chosen to focus on a subset from within the group of texts. I explore the series of Ma'asiyot only which Mesas describes as appearing in Sifrei Ma'asiyot explicitly. That means he introduces it as Sefer Maaseh or Ra'iti Sefer Maaseh, etc., constituting a much smaller body of literature. Focusing on this subset provides a few advantages and unique opportunities. One advantage comes from directing research to alleged recorded texts. This is an increased opportunity to identify the source text for many of these stories, whether Midrash, Talmud, or otherwise. Next, it limits the range of stories from several hundred or possibly 1,000 to roughly only 100 or possibly a couple more than that. Concerning unique opportunities, Mesas provides more depth of contextual data for some of these Ma'asiyot, such as language data, textual sources, and occasionally transmissional data regarding on how these Sifrei Ma'asiyot arrived in his hands. I should also note that Ma'asiyot appear across Mesas's writing and not exclusively in Nhletabot. For example, Mesas's biblical commentary of Minhat Yosef contains dozens of Ma'asiyot, albeit introducing two contrasting forms of literature, Nisim and Meshalim, which on the surface seem to fit within and not outside of the genre of Ma'asiyot. And there's 64 of those, for example, that appear in Minhat Yosef and Bereshit. Additionally, I've identified a few instances of Mesas's halachic responsa, such as in Ozar HaMichtavim, where Mesas explicitly cites Sefer Ma'asiyot, as well as in his work on divorce, Geresh Yerahim, which contains one instance as well. My initial findings on these texts yield some very useful contextual data, which is not necessarily extrapolated to the non-Sifrei Ma'asiyot stories, and some direct textual data or content-driven data. First, turning to the contextual data. Most of the Sifrei Ma'asiyot which Mesas cites are unnamed and identified simply as a Sefer Ma'asiyot or a Sefer Ahad Ma'asiyot. But there are some specific texts which are cited, such as Sefer Zera Emunim, Likutei Ma'asiyot, Sefer Ohalei Ishaq, Hidushim B'Drashot Ma'asiyot, Sefer Ma'asiyot Nifnei Ma'asecha, Sefer Osefede, and lastly, the Sefer Ma'asiyot of Nissim ben Yaakov, Kitab al-Firaj, or as he refers to just as the Sefer Ma'asiyot. Some of the points that emerge are that half of the cited Sifrei Ma'asiyot also have a set of material features that are identified by Mesas. For example, 56 of the Sifrei Ma'asiyot are identified as Ketav Yad, handwritten, with only 3 instances of diffuse printed text, and the remaining have no label. Roughly 25 of the texts have a modifier of being Yashan, old, or a similar term such as Atik, which implies some relative information concerning the age of Sifrei Ma'asiyot. And the last piece of contextual data that I identified is the language in which the Ma'asiyot originally appear. In 25 cases, the stories originally appeared in a variation of Arabic, one instance of a text appearing originally in a mix of Aramaic and Hebrew, and one instance of a text originally in Spanish, but Mesas had read it in Arabic. These data indicate a possibility that many more of these Sifrei Ma'asiyot exist in Arabic, or the largely identified texts may have been written in Arabic as well, supported by the reality that even Nissim ben Yaakov's text is not identified as an originally Arabic text, and he simply cites it without stating that the text is being reproduced into Rabbinic Hebrew. These data illustrate a fair bit about Mesas's teaching philosophy. The texts which Mesas includes are rarely cited with a specific source, leading to a prioritization of content being provided over the specific identification from where these Ma'asiyot arise. The collecting of kitvei yad by Mesas indicates the value added through collecting and recording these Sifrei Maasiyot for both posterity and new audiences. Including these kitvei yad further shows Mesas's interest in providing novel content for his audiences, both in his original Dirushim, that is when he was presenting these to an audience, and in the readers of Nhletabot as a book and as a text. Lastly, the conversion of originally Arabic texts into Hebrew indicates a specific preservation and transmission of text in Rabbinic Hebrew, a language more accessible to much of his contemporary rabbinic world. So looking now at the content of the Sifrei Maasiyot, the application of these data that I presented earlier are significant, but the range of the data contained in the content of the Sifrei Maasiyot is further illustrative of the teaching philosophy of Yosef Mesas. Although the topics covered across the Maasiyot, which Mesas cites from Sifrei Maasiyot, extends far beyond these few topics, I will briefly look today at the role of women in these Maasiyot, the emphasis on relationships between Jews and non-Jews, and the role of business and fiscal ethics, which Mesas features in these Maasiyot. Current scholarship on Mesas's writing has identified a sort of proto-feminism and value of women's roles, and this perspective features the Maasiyot as well. Women appear as characters in roughly 65% of the Maasiyot, which I have analyzed, and they appear as named characters in 15% of the Maasiyot so far. As rabbinic literature is largely a text designed by men for a male audience, there is an unequal representation of women in rabbinic writing. The Sifrei Maasiyot, which Mesas cites in Nhletabot, do not quite escape this reality, but certainly do improve representation, often with active roles for women in the crux or climax of the story. To demonstrate how this functions, I borrow from a structural analysis of North African piyutim, which often appear to follow a pattern of context, calamity, and intervention. This structure is not unique to piyutim, and this is evidenced clearly in many of the Maasiyot presented by Mesas. One clear example of such a Maasiyah is the story from a time of famine in Algeria. This Maasiyah tells the story of an Algerian Jew, Moha, who is forced to convert to Islam to save his life after an altercation with a Muslim man. During a time of plague affecting the animals of Algeria, the French colonial presence restricts access to meats other than fish, eventually increasing the harshness of the restrictions on the Jews, specifically by forbidding Jews from purchasing even the fish. The Jews managed to secretly purchase fish nonetheless from the Algerian Muslims to fulfill Oneg Shabbat. Eventually, the convert Moha goes to inform on the Jews and the Muslims involved in the secret business. Miraculously, before further harm can come to the Jews, the city officer who implemented these harsh decrees chokes to death on a fish bone served to him by his wife, getting his comeuppance, and his son replaces him and removes the harsher decree on the Jews. After witnessing this, Moha sees that he must convert back to Judaism, runs away to Tunisia, returns to Judaism, and eventually establishes himself there. Dividing the story into context, calamity, and intervention, we find that the serving of the fish to the city officer by his wife leads to the downfall and eventual relief of the Jewish people of Algiers, this seeming moment of intervention. This is not only the only story where a woman appears at the turning point from calamity to intervention, but this example provides a somewhat active role for the woman in the story, despite being an unnamed character. Lastly, it is not just peculiar that a woman appears at the turning point, but it's also significant that this redemption comes through the hands of non-Jews as well, i.e. the officer's wife and son, the next major theme which I will address now. The next Maasiyah is a story about stealing from non-Jews and why this is such a grave issue for Mesas. There was an Arab man who lived in Izmir, Turkey, and traded in jewels and had a confidant, Yisrael Mizrahi, a Jewish jeweler who always watched his goods while traveling. There was another Jewish jeweler, Yaakov Peres, who wanted the Arab man to leave his jewels with him while traveling instead of Israel, and even offered to do it for less payment. One time, Israel wasn't in Izmir, so Yaakov convinced the Arab man to leave his jewels. And he had said that he would give them to Israel when he returned to Izmir. However, Yaakov ended up swapping some of the precious stones for counterfeits. When Israel returned, he refused to take the jewels from Yaakov unless the Arab man was present, and this ended up exposing Yaakov because he obviously had swapped the jewels without being able to blame Israel. Despite the strong evidence, Yaakov bribed the judge when this case went to court and won the case. Israel saw this injustice and resolved to help the Arab man regain his lost wealth from this trouble. As it turns out, one of the swapped diamonds belonged to the king, and the king arrested Yaakov, interrogated him, but Yaakov couldn't keep his story straight about where he got the diamond. So the king jailed Yaakov for 6 months, sold all of his goods to compensate the cost of the stolen diamond. After this whole ordeal, Israel said to Yaakov, "See, this is why you shouldn't steal from non-Jews." Mesas sharing this story creates a fascinating tension and important lesson. it is difficult to assert that there are good or evil people in these ma'asiyot, as they often are quite complex embodiments of various values. This does not merely contribute to the relatability of the characters through their complexity, rather also contributes to another reality which Misas is teaching in this ma'asiyah. The main evil character is Yaakov Perez, a Jew, whereas the Arab man, despite being unnamed, is trusting, close to Yisrael Mizrahi, and ultimately a decent, if not good, character. This is not unique to this ma'asiyah, and many non-Jewish characters are seen as either neutral or even righteous from Misas. Obviously, many are not presented in a positive light, but certainly these characters are presented with complexity, humanity, and in many ways as equals or friends of the Jewish characters. There's a much more explicit level of educational value found in this particular story.
You have another 6 minutes, and please, if you can speak slower, thank you.
Sure, yes. There's a much more explicit level of educational value found in this particular story concerning how Jews should view and interact with non-Jews. Misas bookends the ma'asiyah with a statement of reaffirmation that the biblical prohibition against theft, lo tigzol, applies to non-Jews. This fits Misas's overall emphasis on business ethics, a common theme which recurs across the cited Sifrei Ma'asiyot. Many other cited Sifrei Ma'asiyot deal with fiscal ethics issues ranging from inheritance. There's very interesting stories about Eliyahu intervening with a man who passes away and his sons and their inheritance, and helps the father pass on to the next world, dealing with poverty and ways of coping with poverty, financial partnerships, and the prevalence of these sorts of ma'asiyot indicate an importance for Misas to not merely teach religious ritual, but also teach his audience how to engage in business and financial decisions, both intra-religiously, that is among Jews. So a lot of these stories take place with two Jewish figures interacting with each other. For example, there's a story of two business partners traveling between Sidon and Bavel, and their relationship is complicated when one falls sick, and Misas educates how to deal with these situations and how to avoid being deceitful in those cases, and interreligiously as well, when there's an interaction between non-Jews and Jews. For example, this case here, where we see a strong emphasis for lo tigzol applying to non-Jews, and also implying that business ethics is not as flexible in these situations. So this also opens up prospective further research areas as well. So the findings that I present are indicative of a fruitful realm of analysis of Misas's writings overall. And by focusing on ma'asiyot specifically, not only do we further understand Misas's teaching philosophy, both through the contextual data, and we see the information that is behind these ma'asiyot, but also in the content of the ma'asiyot themselves. Another point that emerges here is the process of sourcing and understanding the connection between these rabbinic texts. I've sourced many of these Sifrei Ma'asiyot, and I've identified additions and changes which Misas seems to have made to the material he presents. For example, in Nhletabot 1, Misas cites Bereshit Rabbah 65:22 through the text of a Sefer Ma'asiyot, and the original text of Bereshit Rabbah appears as a much shorter text, and the one that emerges from the Ma'asiyah is far more detailed, includes further resolution, and this pattern is something that is included across these reiterations or repetitions. Another contrasting example of that is in the case of Nisim Gaon's Kitab HaFaraj, where the original story and Misas's version, despite Misas stating explicitly that he has copied it bli guzmaot, without any exaggeration, there's a fair bit of differences between the texts, and it's not clear if exaggeration would imply a difference of manuscript or a difference of source material as well. Further, the applications of my analysis can be extended to the remaining Ma'asiyot across Misas's writing, and that of other rabbinic authors as well. This is not a uniquely Misas form of writing. We have several Sifrei Ma'asiyot that emerge in North Africa as well, and around the same time, as well as there is a rich Ashkenazi tradition of Sipurei Ma'asiyot. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Breslov tradition, which has a substantial body of literature that is built around this genre of Ma'asiyot. Additionally, and lastly, there's a tremendous amount of historical and historiographical information found in these Ma'asiyot, which could also serve as a basis for future research. For example, the story that I presented from Algeria, Mesas provides a year for that story. However, the events of that story and the famine that took place is a real historical event that took place 100 years off from when Mesas had cited that story having occurred. Additionally, Mesas places the entire story with the French colonial presence at a time when there was no French colonial presence in Algeria altogether. So there are historiographic elements that show some pieces of truth and historicity to these stories, but other elements that seem to complicate and make it more difficult to trust these sources as strongly historical pieces of evidence. And I know I've covered a lot of diverse sets of information today, and this talk sort of serves as an introduction to my broader research project, and I'm happy to discuss any subset of information in further details during the questions. Thank you to all the organizers of this conference and to everyone in attendance, and I look forward to hearing the remaining talks for today.